guys are listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast, and I'm here with my friend from many years ago, Dr. Stephen Witmer. I think at the time you were on your way to being doctor, but not quite yet doctor. Is that right, Stephen?
That's right. We both knew each other in Cambridge, which would have been about 23 or 24 years ago.
Yeah, that's a wild thought.
Yeah.
So Stephen has a PhD from the University of Cambridge, and he is now, sort of funnily enough, life has taken both of us to New England, which was more of a departure for me because I'm born and bred English. But Stephen, as you guys may have discerned from his dulcet tones, comes from the US originally, and he is pastor of Pepperell Christian Fellowship, which is a little bit sort of to the north of where I am in Cambridge, Mass, but not too far. It's about 45 minutes an hour drive.
Yeah, that's right. About an hour.
From where we are. Stephen is also a council member for the Gospel Coalition, a board member for Desiring God. His books include Eternity Changes Everything, A Big Gospel in Small Places, and the book we're going to be mostly discussing today, In All Things Thee to See, a devotional guide to selected poems of George Herbert. Stephen, tell us where you come from in the US originally, why you went to proper Cambridge, and what brought you back to the East Coast and to the little town of Pepperell. Is it a town?
It is a small town, 12,000 people. Yeah. Yeah, I grew up in a much smaller town, the town of Monson in north central Maine, on the Appalachian Trail, just 100 miles south of the end of the trail at Mount Katahdin. My dad was a pastor, and I grew up as a follower of Jesus Christ. I think because my dad was a pastor and because I admired him so much, that was a large part of the reason I wanted to be a pastor. And I had a vocational aspiration toward the pastorate. When other little kids were saying, I want to be a firefighter or policeman, I was saying, I want to be a pastor. And I grew into that, into the reality of that vocation over time. I left New England. I went away to the Midwest for college, and then even further away in Minneapolis for 2 years to do a pastoral internship. And it was during those years that I was introduced to Reformed theology. I was introduced to the sovereignty of God, this idea that He is in control of all things, and that all credit for salvation goes to Him. And I was beginning to read some of the great scholars and preachers of the Great Awakening in New England in the 1700s. And I was also aware that New England is a place where there's a great spiritual need. And those things combined to give me a sense of clear calling back to New England, and specifically to pastoral ministry in New England.
I'm going to pause you there, Stephen, for those who don't know what the Great Awakening is. Give us a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
On what you're talking about there.
The Great Awakening was a remarkable time in New England in the 1700s when, largely under the anointed preaching of people like Jonathan Edwards and the British English preacher George Whitefield, God began to draw large numbers of people to saving faith and to a much deeper experience of Him. And I started to read especially the writings of Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, and I just became aware that this place I had grown up in was a place where God had moved very powerfully, and I was feeling the difference between my experience of New England and what had happened in the 1700s, and a longing for God to move again, work again. And already at that point, I think even during that time in the Midwest and in Minneapolis, I was growing in my understanding of the importance of church in God's plans, and even more of a kind of a deeper understanding of the importance of pastoral ministry and a sense of calling to it. So all those things were combining to give me a pretty clear sense of calling back to pastoral ministry in New England. I came back to Gordon Conwell Seminary and did a degree there because it's on the North Shore of Boston, and I wanted to be in New England. And some of the people who were influencing me during those years were pastors and really loved people, loved to shepherd people, and had done a significant amount of study and were really skilled at studying the Bible, understanding the Bible, explaining the Bible. And that model of pastor-scholar was very attractive to me. So that's why I moved to England and did a PhD in New Testament studies. And I thought maybe I'll do some teaching, but mainly I just want to study the Bible more and be more gifted and equipped to teach and preach the Bible and explain it in the context of a church. So when I moved back to New England, Em and I had been married for a year, and I took a 1-year teaching position at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, teaching New Testament. And that was a crazy year because I was teaching 5 courses basically from scratch. So I would give a lecture, come back to our apartment, start preparing for the next lecture. I was just like by the hair of my chinny chin chin. I was staying afloat. And we used that year to look around for churches in New England. And we found this church, Pepperell Christian Fellowship, that needed a pastor. It was not really the kind of church we were looking for, and I was not the kind of pastoral candidate they were looking for. And it's a longer story, but it was like God made it very clear he was calling us to this church in ways that are so clear and so have been so encouraging for 17 and a half years. This coming June, we'll have been here for 18 years.
I love that. I love how, Stephen, when you said by the hair of your chinny chin chin, I was looking at the hair on your chinny chin chin. Those who are watching on YouTube, Stephen has a sort of a scraggly beard, I think I'm going to call it. You know, not full, but present, definitely making its presence felt. Stephen, remind me, what was your PhD on?
It was a New Testament PhD, and the title was Divine Instruction in Early Christianity. So I was writing on passages like John 6:45, where Jesus says, and they will all be taught by God. As it says in the prophets, they will all be taught by God. So there's this Old Testament prophetic understanding that in the last days, it's a new covenant understanding. God will teach his people directly. Jeremiah 31, you won't have teachers saying know the Lord, because they'll all know me from least to the greatest. And Jesus in Matthew 23, I think, and in John 6, and John in 1 John chapter 2 and other places, Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4, pick up on this end time new covenant expectation and claim that it's being fulfilled through Jesus and the Holy Spirit.
So just pressing on that for a second, you've told us that you felt very called to be a pastor and a teacher. And you've just told us that under the new covenant with Jesus, that God's people don't need teachers. So help us square that circle. Yeah.
Well, to me, the most exciting outcome of my PhD work was a fairly basic one, and that is that because Jesus has come and Jesus is God, Jesus fulfills the prophetic promise of direct end-time instruction. God says, I'm going to teach you myself in the last days. And Jesus comes, and particularly in John's gospel, it's very clear that Jesus is God, and Jesus provides that direct divine instruction. And then what I do as a teacher and pastor is explain what he has said. I'm not giving new revelation. I'm unpacking the revelation he has given.
So let's move to the new book that you have coming out. Actually, as we're recording this, I think you said it's coming out tomorrow, and I think this episode is going to come out next week. So hopefully, it'll just be a few days in the past. You have decided to write a book based on poetry, and not just any old poetry, but poetry from a sort of long dead Brit, which the best kind of poetry, or at least some of the best poetry. So tell us a little more about how does poetry in general fit into this? How does the particular devotional poetry of George Herbert fit into this for you, fit into your devotional life, and how you might want others to reflect on that?
It's so funny. You never know where life is going to take you. And I never would have guessed that I would be on a podcast with a Cambridge PhD in English talking about poetry. I feel so out of my depth and overmatched. So many things about the nuances of poetry that I don't know. But I'll tell you, I sort of fell into this about a decade ago. I started just to read poetry more than I had before. I had always been intimidated by poetry. I said to someone, I think one of my greatest qualifications for writing this book is that until about a decade ago, I did not really appreciate poetry. Right. And I was intimidated by it. It felt inefficient. It felt like, if I want entertainment, I find better ways to be entertained. If I want information, I can find more efficient ways to get information. And poetry always put me off because it felt like a work to solve. It felt like a puzzle to solve, and half the time I wasn't sure I had solved the puzzle. It felt ambiguous. But I started to read some poets who are a little bit more clear. The former poet laureate of the U.S., Billy Collins, who's very funny, very engaging, and I think actually very profound as well. I began to read him and enjoy him. And I was writing another book. I was writing A Big Gospel in Small Places, which is about small town ministry. And I was looking for historical examples of small town pastors. And I remembered I had this book on my shelf of George Herbert. And he wrote in the, it would have been about 400 years ago now. He wrote a book called The Country Parson on small town ministry. It was one of his only prose works. So I pulled it off the shelf and read it. And I thought, well, this is really helpful. And this is good. More people should know about this. But then I started to find out about his life. I got really intrigued by his life. And then I started to dip into the poetry. And the poetry was amazing. The poetry, I would say The Country Parson and George Herbert's life were intriguing and helpful, but the poetry has been life-shaping for me.
Stephen, why don't you go ahead and read us, or if you have it memorized, declaim to us your favorite of George Herbert's poems, because we can't talk about poetry if we aren't also reading poetry. So
I would love to share with you. I don't have it memorized, but I would love to read to you probably the poem that has most impacted me personally. There are many that have shaped me and are currently, even as a pastor, shaping my understanding of how to use language and my desire to engage people in fresh ways, not old hackneyed ways, kind of churchy words, all that kind of thing. But the poem that has most impacted me personally is a poem called Aaron. And in this Crossway book, I've chosen 40 of Herbert's more accessible and shorter poems, partly because I'm not writing the book mainly for people like you, Rebecca, who are well-versed in literature and poetry. Although I hope you'll enjoy it too. I'm writing more for people who are a little bit antsy, a little bit nervous about poetry, like I was. And so this one by George Herbert, Aaron, it's only 5 stanzas, 5 lines each stanza, so it reads pretty quickly. And maybe the most helpful thing to say before I read it is that this, I think, is one of the best expressions of a doctrine called the imputed righteousness of Christ. So the imputed righteousness of Christ is the teaching that when I trust in Jesus and am united to him by faith, his track record of perfection is credited to my account. So in some ways, nothing changes because I'm still a sinful person. But in another more profound way, everything changes because God looks at me as though I've done the things Jesus has done.
Yeah.
All right, so
tell us, Stephen, just before you read, tell us who Aaron is.
Yeah, Aaron is Moses' brother. I'm reading through the book of Exodus right now in the Old Testament, and Moses is the great Old Testament figure who leads the children of Israel out of captivity in Egypt and leads them through the wilderness toward the promised land. Aaron is his brother, and Aaron is the first high priest. So he ministers in the tabernacle, the portable tent, where God's presence dwells. Aaron ministers in that tabernacle and helps to make atonement for the people of God. He helps to offer sacrifices so that the holy God can live among his people.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. Go for it.
Okay, this is the 5 stanzas of Aaron. Holiness on the head, light and perfections on the breast, harmonious bells below, raising the dead, to lead them unto life and rest. Thus are true Aarons dressed. Profaneness in my head, defects and darkness in my breast, a noise of passions ringing me for dead, unto a place where is no rest. Poor priest, thus am I dressed. Only another head I have, another heart and breast, another music making live, not dead, without whom I could have no rest. In him I am well dressed. Christ is my only head, my alone only heart and breast, my only music, striking me even dead, that to the old man I may rest, and be in him new dressed. So holy in my head, perfect and light in my dear breast, my doctrine tuned by Christ, who is not dead, but lives in me while I do rest. Come, people, Aaron's dressed. Mm. So probably the other helpful thing to say would be that George Herbert was a country priest. He was an Anglican priest in the tiny little town of Bemerton near Salisbury. And he often struggled with anxiety. He was not like a super confident person. I think he wrestled like I often do with feelings of anxiety. And I imagine him as he starts this poem sitting. He's walked across the street from the manse in Bemerton to the little church, the Anglican church, and he's sitting there in this darkened room, and he's waiting for the parishioners to come in. They were mostly farmers. So here's this incredible guy. He went to the University of Cambridge. He was the Public Order of Cambridge. Now he's a country parson. Things have changed in his life. And he is overwhelmed with the sense of responsibility and doesn't feel prepared for guiding these people into the presence of God on this Sunday morning. And he's thinking about, he's feeling inadequate as a priest. He's thinking about the perfect priest. So that's why he says, holiness on the head, light and perfections on the breast. He's describing Aaron, the perfect high priest, the great high priest. And then he contrasts himself, profaneness in my head, defects and darkness in my breast. Actually, he's not just worried about being an inadequate priest. He's concerned, am I even going to heaven? He says, a noise of passions ringing me for dead, unto a place where is no rest. Poor priest, thus am I dressed. So he's concerned about even the state of his soul. He's thinking, I'm not worthy to minister to this people. And one of the reasons this has so impacted me is that as a pastor, there have been many times where I have woken up at 4:30 or 5 a.m. on a Sunday morning, aware of the ministry that needs to be done and my own great inadequacy to do it. And I really feel like there's many times there's been a spiritual attack where Satan brings to my mind the people who I should be seeing, who I've not had a chance to see, the ministries I should be building, I've not had a chance to build. And those hours between like 4:30 and the first service starting at 8:30 on Sunday mornings, many times those have been a period of wrestling. So I can so identify with what George Herbert is experiencing here. And there's this little pivot in the poem because he's feeling over his head, inadequate. But then he says, only another head I have, another heart and breast, another music. And it's not totally clear what or who that is until the 4th stanza. Christ is my only head, my alone only heart and breast, my only music striking me even dead, that to the old man I may rest and be in him new dressed. And he's using biblical imagery of putting on a new person. This is like the imagery of the book of Colossians. Put off the old person, the old man, put on the new. And he says, I'm new dressed in Christ. So this is the idea of the imputed righteousness of Christ, that even though I am inadequate, I am sinful, when I'm united to Christ through faith, I possess adequacy in him. I have his righteousness. And then he finishes, so holy in my head, perfect in light in my dear breast, my doctrine tuned by Christ, who is not dead, but lives in me while I do rest. And then my favorite, the last line, come people, Aaron's dressed. Mm-hmm. So there he is, he's ready. He's ready now. And here's one of the most amazing things about this poem. I think it's actually embodying what he's saying, because you can't see it because you're just listening to it. But if you look at this poem on the page, each of the 5 stanzas each of the 5 lines in each of the 5 stanzas ends with the same word. So it's head, breast, dead, rest, dressed in all 5 stanzas. And I think what Herbert is doing is showing us, he's embodying this reality that even though there's stasis, there's something static, it's just repeated over and over again. Nothing changes in some sense, but everything changes in another sense. He's the same George Herbert. He's the same inadequate, sinful person, but he can say, come people, Aaron's dressed, because he is dressed with the righteousness of Christ. I mean, that's amazing to me.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fabulous. I love as well, and you're going to have to fill us in on how Aaron in the Old Testament specifically is dressed.
Yeah.
Because he's picking up on the very specific clothes that Aaron's wearing, right? So talk us through that piece.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, Aaron's outfit in the Old Testament includes bells on the hem of his garment. It includes gemstones that represent the people of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. So yes,
on his
Herbert
chest,
is
right. He's carrying it on his chest. Yeah. Yeah,
exactly. So George Herbert is picking up on this Old Testament imagery, and he's using it, and he's playing with that move from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and the clothing of believers with the righteousness of Christ. And that's classic George Herbert. I mean, he knows the Bible backward and forward. He has multiple poems about the Bible. He loved the Bible. He alludes to it in remarkable ways. His ability to know lots of things, but then to not just to state them, but to embody them and to give us an experience of those things through the poem is one of the things that makes him unique and special. Yeah.
I love how in that poem you kind of get a worked theology of how to understand Old Testament elements like the priesthood of Aaron.
That's right.
In light of who Jesus is, because often what we'll see in the Old Testament is there'll be kind of physical, literal things that point to spiritual realities. So, one classic example would be the sacrificial animals, a sacrificial lamb in the Old Testament. That's like a physical animal that's being sacrificed in the temple. And then Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And I love how here you see the clothes that Aaron wears, which in their original context are also kind of symbolic, right? You've got the 12 tribes of Israel symbolically pictured on his chest. You've got his turban, you've got his belt. Like it's all, right. The clothing has a meaning beyond itself, but it's a sort of physical, literal thing pointing to something beyond itself.
That's right. And it's very Christ-centered too, isn't it? Even the poem is building from one stanza, but another heart, another head I have, my alone, only heart is Christ.
And I love how it takes the physical items that point to spiritual truths in the Old Testament and claims them and sort of applies them in New Testament ways to spiritual realities that are kind of taken in internally. Because it's not that he's not saying, Aaron was dressed like this, and then I, as an Anglican vicar, I'm dressed in these clothes, and this is he's actually saying, no, this outward clothing has become an inward clothing in Christ, that it's kind of drilled deep into me. Stephen, I'm curious for your thoughts on this. People will sometimes say to me, how can you take the Bible literally? And I think often what they really mean is how can you take the Bible seriously with all its wild claims, right? The Bible is making some very outrageous claims about who God is, who we are, our sinfulness before the Lord, like all sorts of, Jesus' resurrection. There are all sorts of big claims the Bible is making, and people might say, how can you take the miracles of Jesus literally, or in that sense? But I think what's masked often by that question is how much of the Bible demands to not be read literally, actually. Mm-hmm. You were saying you used to really struggle with poetry and sort of not really see the value of it. And I was thinking, well, I don't know how you read the prophets. I don't know how you read the Psalms. Like you must have struggled with an awful lot of the Bible if you're, I don't mean that in a sort of diminishing way, but just the reality is if you sit down and read through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, you're going to be confronted with an awful lot of things that are not, that are demanding a reading that is faithful but not literal. Mm-hmm. Not that it reduces the sort of shock value of the Bible, because the Bible is shocking and alarming and troubling in many good and beautiful and hard ways, but that when we talk about reading the Bible literally, we actually flatten it out in a way that it refuses to be flattened.
Yeah. That's right. I do think one of the great values for me of the last decade of beginning to read poetry more is coming alive to the richness of metaphor and simile and the beauty of language. And all of that is true in biblical poetry as well. And I think you're right. If the Bible, for me, the key is, what does the biblical author intend? Does the biblical author intend to be read literally or metaphorically? And if the biblical author intends to be read metaphorically, I will do him great injustice to try to squeeze him into a literal mode. And so I've spent a decent amount of time preaching through Revelation and doing some thinking and writing about Revelation. And there's a classic example of the problems we can get into when we miss Old Testament allusions and when we miss metaphorical language. We can begin to read in ways that the biblical authors would not want us to read if we're not reading them on their own terms.
Yes, and I'm sure you would agree with this as well. There are also times when what the biblical author may have intended is actually, for example, there'll be certain portions of the Old Testament that we look at through the lens of the New Testament and realize that the biblical author most likely didn't fully understand what he was writing at the time anyway. That there's actually a whole kind of overlay.
That's right.
And a fresh lens on the scriptures that comes with the coming of Christ, and suddenly all sorts of things spring to life in different ways.
Yeah.
Which is not to say it's not important what the original author intended and how it was understood in its first context, but that we'll sometimes have to sort of do that work and then also do the work of looking at it through the New Testament lens.
Yeah, one of the I think one of the things that that poetry can help us with as well in appreciating in the Bible is the beauty of language. I mentioned that a time or two, but the Bible doesn't just say true things, it says true things beautifully often. And it encourages us to care about beauty. I mean, the garments of the high priest are beautiful garments. And the Psalms are often beautiful and memorable Psalms. And figures, characters in the Bible are sometimes described for their physical beauty. So these things are not diminished. They are celebrated. And in my mind, one of the things that poetry can contribute to people who are seeking to follow Jesus is, let's use language the way the Bible uses language. I think so often we kind of flatten out language, and we speak in cliches and expressions that are just old and tired, or kind of in-group language. And one of the great benefits for me of reading Herbert is just allowing, even before I understand many of these poems, I just allow the language to begin to wash over me. And you can appreciate things that you haven't fully comprehended. In fact, one of the reasons you do the effort, you make the effort of understanding, is because something about it attracts you. And I think some of the great critics, T.S. Eliot is one of them, have said you start with enjoyment, and enjoyment spurs you to press in further. So I mean, I have all these words and phrases of Herbert that have really captured me. Here's one from his poem Gratefulness. He says, "But such a heart whose pulse may be thy praise," and the "thy" is capitalized. So I want a heart whose pulse may be thy praise. And I even think there's he's embodying what he's talking about there, because you can hear the pulse, and the pulse may be thy praise. The pulse may be thy praise. I want that kind of heart it's good things are emerging out of it every time it beats. It's beating for you. That you just the pulse in my wrist. That it's praising you. That's such creative, fresh use of language. That's so much better than much of what's done in our churches. And we just get lazy, and maybe we get nervous, and so we kind of revert to language that has lost a lot of its freshness and its power and energy.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. In the way that the Bible kind of models for us the extraordinary use of metaphor and simile and beautiful language to communicate beautiful truths. It's so interesting. Actually, I'm curious for your thoughts on this, Stephen, because you mentioned that in the Bible sometimes people are described as beautiful.
Yeah.
In the New Testament, they're not. I mean, that's true in the Old Testament. There's a certain number of people, including Rebecca, my namesake, who is supposedly beautiful in the Old Testament. I actually find it beautiful that in the New Testament, not a single woman is described in terms of a physical appearance, positively or it's irrelevant in terms of people's relationship with Jesus, which I find, in fact, the only woman who Jesus calls beautiful is the woman who pours ointment on his feet, and he says she's done a beautiful thing for me.
Yeah, that's
her
interesting.
action, not her body that's beautiful.
Yeah. What about the bride of Christ in Ephesians 5, adorned, or in Revelation? But not a particular specific individual.
Yes. Yes. So we together as Jesus' bride are stunningly beautiful. But your or my physical appearance here and now it seems rather beside the point from a New Testament perspective.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and while beauty itself is not denigrated, and we are pointed toward a beautiful new creation.
Absolutely.
Maybe yes. That kind of individual physical beauty. Yeah, I mean, because I'm thinking of other passages too that say what's beautiful to God is a gentle and quiet spirit. So there's an interior beauty.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's interesting. Sort of following that thread.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I don't want to say the Old Testament cares about external beauty and the New Testament doesn't, because surely the new creation is embodied and external and physical too. So that's probably too simplistic, but maybe there is something about at an individual level there. It does seem like there. Yeah, I mean, I think you're picking up on something that's true.
Yeah, and I think this is getting us off as a tangent, but it's kind of a fun one. So much, I mean, they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and there is a deep and real truth to that, partly because how we receive somebody, as we look at them physically, is massively informed by how we feel about them, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I look at my baby and I think this is the most beautiful baby in the world, regardless of whether, and I'm very happy that other people think their baby is the most beautiful, but clearly mine is in fact the most we have this deep internal kind of bias of love that comes with relationship. And so I suspect that actually in Jesus' new creation, we will all be overwhelmingly beautiful to one another because we're reflecting Jesus' glory and because we're seeing each other with those eyes of love.
Mm-hmm. That's a great thought.
I had I nearly laughed out loud a few years ago. I read some article, I forget exactly what it was called, but it was along the lines of, if I met my husband today in a bar, would I even find him attractive? Kind of. It was sort of some stupid article that somebody had published somewhere, and I thought, what a foolish question. I couldn't look at my husband and not see my husband. And he's gorgeous to me because he's mine, and I can't even. The idea of if I hadn't known him and I'd met him at the ages that we are now, what would he have thought of me? Who cares?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I even feel like in my own life, in my own marriage, I feel like Emma's attraction for me grew because of our relationship.
Yeah.
And I feel like I was attracted to her much more initially, even totally apart from me. I saw who she was. And it was not as much of a function of our relationship. Now that has grown since then. But some of that's maybe the way Emma's wired. The attraction grew as a function of knowing me, of sharing things with me, and growing confidence and sharing experiences together. And she didn't really think of me apart from her and say, wow, incredibly attractive guy. It was in the process of knowing me and trusting herself to me and having that reciprocated and growing confidence in one another. That's where the attraction grew. So I love that. I love that thought. Thank you for that idea that in the new creation, we see each other that way. We see each other beautiful because of that. Yeah.
For those not particularly familiar with the Bible, the first thing that the Bible says about human beings is we hear sort of internal monologue of the Lord saying, let us make man, meaning mankind, in our own image. And God making human beings, male and female, in his image, sort of somehow reflective of him. And the times when we are overwhelmed by somebody else's beauty, and whether maybe it's the person that you meet and feel sort of massive romantic feelings for, or maybe it's the baby in your arms, or maybe it's there are so many contexts where we can look at somebody and just think, oh, there's something kind of just glorious about this being in my presence. There's something wildly, outrageously beautiful. That's, I think, one little hint of the reality that actually all of us are made in the image of the ineffably beautiful God, who I think C.S. Lewis sort of talks about this at one point. We're sort of saying if we could truly see one another as we are sort of spiritual beings, we would be overwhelmed and almost tempted to worship, because if you get even a glimpse of the reflected glory of God, it's something astonishing to see. But yeah, it's wonderful to just get tiny glimpses of that as we look around our own worlds.
Yeah, it is. And I remember Marilyn Robinson in her novel Gilead. There's a character, and he's an older retired pastor, I think, and he sits around just taking the beauty that he sees around him and multiplying by something like 10 to imagine the new creation. He'd multiply by more if he had the energy, but all he's got right. is 10.
Yeah.
So you take what you have, and then you say, oh, this is going to be even better. It's going to be even more beautiful.
Yeah, and I think poetry, I'm so thankful, Stephen, that you've written this book and kind of pointed us to some of the rich and beautiful poems that we can kind of retrieve from history that help us to reflect on who we are and who God is, and how the Lord Jesus has bridged the gap in the most profound way between who we are and who God is, and how actually there are some things that only poetry can really capture, and only kind of metaphorical language can even attempt to connect us to. And I mean, I nearly use the word grasp, but I don't think it is grasping, because we can never really wrap our minds around this any more than we can wrap our minds around the number of stars in the universe. It's sort of beyond our brains, but that we can get a sense of the pulse of the beauty and the glory of God.
Yeah. And for me, I think a major realization has been that reading a poem, my job is not to get the message out of the poem. And if you think about it that way, the poem is just a hindrance. You need to kind of get what it's actually saying, and it's just work to kind of get all the other stuff away, and then you get the treasure out. That's a complete misconception. In my mind, the metaphor that's been helpful is when I get to know a person, like one of my children, I I want to know the whole person. I want to know them as an embodied person. And I don't want to just connect with their brain or their spirit. I want to know them in their body. I know what they look like. And I want to hug my kids. And a poem is a full experience. You don't just try to get the message out of it. Flannery O'Connor one time said about fiction that if a work of fiction can be boiled down to a summary, it must not be a very good work of fiction.
Right. Yeah.
Because it needs to be, it's embodied. And I would say exactly the same thing about a poem. Now, and that really helps me in reading a poem, and therefore in reading scripture, that you are understanding it and engaging with it as a whole thing. And you're experiencing it that way, not just to get a little message and, to understand, but even to be shaped and affected by it through your eyes and your ears and through a body, because it is an embodied message. It's embodied truth.
Yeah, and if you think about it, if God had simply wanted to deliver a sort of pithy message to us, he could have sent us a pamphlet.
That's right. Yeah.
And instead, he gives us 66 books that have so much texture and depth and complexity to them,
and narrative, story, and poetry.
Yeah, all of the above. Fun fact: when my husband Brian, who Stephen knew both Brian and me, I think you knew us independently before.
I did. I knew you both before I knew you together.
So my impression is that everyone who knew us both before we knew each other, before we started dating, was like very confused, very surprised when we started dating. Do you recall?
Yeah, I think I thought, wow, they're quite different people.
Yeah, exactly. People were like, okay. But one of the sweetest things Brian ever did was he's an engineer, so poetry doesn't spring naturally from his blood. No offense to any engineers listening and who are in fact deeply interested in poetry. I'm sure you exist, really. But he knew that I loved poetry. And he also knew that love poetry was a thing. And so when he wanted to tell me that he loved me for the first time, he went and sat in a bookstore and he got a bunch of poetry books and he sort of read through them and did the engineer thing of thinking, let me see if I can figure out how this works, and then sort of reverse engineer it, like let me try and kind of produce a poem to tell this girl that I love her. And you know what? He actually did a really good job, which I remain mildly surprised and grateful to this day. But it was actually rather good. But the reason for saying that, other than just to praise and slightly tease my beloved husband, is that if in fact the Bible is in one sense a love poem to us from the God of all the universe who made us, it's not surprising that he included quite a lot of poetry, sort of actual poetry, in his communication. Stephen, thanks so much for joining me and for writing this lovely book, which comes out, as we said, tomorrow. Where can people find it if they so wish to purchase a copy?
It's published by Crossway, so it's available through them or Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever you get your books.
Lovely. And remind us of the full title.
In All Things Thee to See, a devotional guide to selected poems of George Herbert.
Thanks, Stephen. You guys have been listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast. You can follow it on X or Twitter. No, X is Twitter. X or Instagram or wherever you follow things. This may or may not be there. You can subscribe on confrontingchristianity.org for a weekly newsletter. You can subscribe on YouTube. But better than any of those things, you could grab a copy of Stephen's book. And between now and next week, when I might be speaking into your AirPods again, maybe grab Google or pick up a copy from your shelf, which I'm sure has George Herbert's complete works on it. Read one of George Herbert's poems. Stephen's introduced us to one and a little smattering of another. But maybe sit down and read one of those and see if you start to wonder if there is something to be appreciated, something to be felt, something to be kind of seen, as we think about relating to God through the medium of poetry. even alongside reading the Bible itself, which is chock full of beautiful poetry. And ask yourself, if we know, and we know this from songs, we know this from poems, and we know this from our daily lives, if it is true that sometimes love is best expressed through poetry, could it be true that the God of all the universe loves you so desperately much that he actually wrote a book full of poems to tell you about him?